The year is 1483. London. The Tower of London stands against the grey English sky, not yet the grim fortress of execution we know today, but a royal palace, gleaming with possibility and power. Within its ancient walls, two young boys play in the gardens. Their laughter echoes through the stone corridors. They are princes, heirs to the throne of England, the future of a kingdom. But by the end of that summer, those voices will fall silent, the boys will vanish, and for over 500 years, the world has been asking the same haunting question: what happened to the princes in the tower? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we explore the most mysterious disappearances in history, cases that haunt us, that keep us up at night, that refuse to be forgotten. And today, we're diving into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the medieval world. A case involving power, betrayal, two innocent children, and a secret that has been buried for centuries. This is the story of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, two boys who should have ruled England, but instead became ghosts in history. This is the story of the princes in the tower, but before we begin, if you're fascinated by unsolved disappearances and historical mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We post new cases every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to England, 1483, and uncover what really happened. To understand how two royal princes could simply vanish, we need to understand the world they were born into. This wasn't a time of peace and stability. This was England in the midst of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal, decades-long civil war between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Picture it, noble families tearing each other apart for the crown. Battles fought in muddy fields. Kings rising and falling. Loyalties shifting like sand. This was a world where today's trusted ally could be tomorrow's executioner. Where children learned early that power was everything, and that mercy was a luxury few could afford. Into this violent world, on November 2, 1470, a boy was born at Westminster Abbey. His name was Edward. He was the son of King Edward IV, a tall, charismatic warrior king who had fought his way to the throne, and Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful commoner whose marriage to the king had scandalized the court. Young Edward was born to be king. From his first breath, he was the heir apparent, the future of the Yorkist dynasty. 3 years later, in 1473, his brother Richard was born. The two boys grew up together in the royal household, surrounded by tutors, servants, and all the privileges of royalty. By all accounts, they were close. Brothers. Friends. Partners in the innocent games of childhood, unaware of the dark forces already circling around them. Their father, Edward IV, was a strong king. He had stabilized the realm after years of chaos. He had enemies, he always had enemies, but he ruled with an iron fist and a keen political mind. The kingdom seemed secure. The boy's future seemed certain, and then, in April of 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV fell ill. Some say it was pneumonia. Others whisper of poison, though no evidence has ever been found. What we know is this: on April 9, 1483, at the age of just 40, Edward IV died. Suddenly, 12-year-old Edward was no longer just a prince. He was King Edward V of England, but he would never be crowned. When Edward IV died, young Edward was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, being raised and educated by his mother's family, the Woodvilles. His younger brother Richard, now 9 years old, was in London with their mother, the Queen Dowager Elizabeth Woodville. According to royal custom, a regency council was established to govern until Edward V came of age. But power in medieval England was never about custom, it was about force. And the most powerful man in England wasn't a member of the Woodville family. It was the dead king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about Richard III. History has not been kind to him. Thanks largely to William Shakespeare's play, written over a century after Richard's death, he's been portrayed as a twisted, evil hunchback who murdered his way to the throne. Now is the winter of our discontent, and all that, but the real Richard was far more complex, and far more dangerous that he was a skilled military commander. Loyal to his brother Edward throughout the Wars of the Roses. Capable, intelligent, and ruthless when he needed to be. He had governed the north of England efficiently and had a reputation for justice. Many of his contemporaries respected him. Some even liked him, but he also had something that would prove fatal for the young princes, ambition. When Edward IV died, Richard moved quickly. He intercepted young Edward on his way to London, supposedly to protect him from the Woodville family's influence. Richard argued that the Woodvilles were power-hungry commoners who would manipulate the young king for their own benefit. He positioned himself as the loyal uncle, the experienced soldier and statesman who would guide England through this transition. The Regency Council, composed of nobles who had their own reasons to fear Woodville power, agreed. Richard was named Lord Protector of England. He would rule in Edward's name until the boy came of age. On May 4, 1483, 12-year-old Edward V entered London. But he didn't go to Westminster Palace or any of the traditional royal residences. Instead, Richard brought him to the Tower of London. Now, this might sound ominous to us today, but at the time, it wasn't unusual. The Tower was a royal palace, a fortress, a treasury, and yes, sometimes a prison, but it was also the traditional residence for monarchs before their coronation. Kings of England had been staying at the Tower before their crowning ceremonies for generations. Edward's coronation was set for June 22, 1483. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. The young king was safe in the Tower, preparations for the coronation were underway, and Richard was acting as a proper Lord Protector should, but Richard had other plans. In mid-June, Richard convinced, or forced, Queen Elizabeth Woodville to send her younger son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, to join his brother in the Tower. The official reason? So the brothers could keep each other company, and so young Richard could participate in the coronation festivities. Elizabeth Woodville was suspicious. She had already fled to Westminster Abbey with her younger children, claiming sanctuary, a medieval practice where churches offered protection from arrest. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it. But she was a widow now, with no army, no real power. And Richard of Gloucester was Lord Protector, with the support of the nobles and control of London. She had no choice. She sent her youngest son to the Tower. The two brothers were together now. Edward and Richard. 12 and 9 years old. Playing in the Tower gardens, unaware that they were now pieces in a deadly game of chess. And then, just days before Edward's coronation, Richard made his move. On June 22, 1483, Edward V should have been crowned king. The ceremony was planned. The guests were invited. The crown was ready, but June 22 came and went. No coronation. No king. What happened? Richard of Gloucester happened. In the days leading up to the planned coronation, Richard unleashed a carefully orchestrated political coup. First, he arrested and executed several members of the Woodville family and other nobles loyal to Edward V, accusing them of treason and plotting against him. Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's closest friends and a powerful nobleman, was executed without trial. His crime? Allegedly opposing Richard's plans. Then came the bombshell. On June 25, 1483, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross in London. The preacher claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Why? because Edward had supposedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth. This pre-contract, according to medieval law, meant Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous and therefore illegal, and if the marriage was illegal, that meant their children were illegitimate, bastards, not eligible for the throne. This claim was formalized in a document called the Titulus Regius, the title of the king. Parliament, heavily influenced by Richard and his supporters, declared young Edward and his brother Richard illegitimate. Stripped of their royal status. Removed from the line of succession, and with the princes out of the way, who was next in line for the throne? Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III of England. The speed of it all is breathtaking. From Edward IV's death on April 9 to Richard III's coronation on July 6, less than 3 months. In that time, Richard had gone from loyal uncle to Lord Protector to King of England. And 2 young boys had gone from future monarchs to illegitimate prisoners, but Richard's coronation wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the mystery, because after Richard became king, something strange started happening at the Tower of London. The princes started disappearing from view. In the early days after they arrived at the Tower, Edward and Richard were frequently seen. Servants reported seeing them playing in the gardens. They appeared at windows. They walked the grounds. They were visible, 2 young boys in royal captivity, but alive, healthy, seemingly safe. But after Richard's coronation, things changed. One of our key sources for this period is an Italian diplomat named Dominic Mancini, who was in London during these events. In his account, written shortly after leaving England, Mancini describes what he observed: the princes were seen less and less frequently. At first, they appeared at the windows of the tower. Then they were moved to the inner apartments, deeper within the fortress, away from public view. Day by day, Mancini writes, they were seen more rarely, withdrawn into the inner chambers of the tower, and then, by the end of that summer of 1483, they stopped appearing altogether. The official explanation: there wasn't one. The princes simply vanished from public record. No announcements. No explanations. No royal proclamations about their status or whereabouts. They were there one day, and then, gone. Rumors immediately began to spread through London. People whispered in marketplaces and taverns. Nobles spoke in hushed tones in their private chambers. Even across the Channel, in France and Burgundy, people were asking the same question: where were the princes? In July 1483, there was even an attempt to rescue them. A plot was formed to break into the tower and free Edward and Richard, to spirit them away to safety and possibly restore Edward to his rightful throne. But the plot was discovered before it could be carried out. The conspirators were arrested, and after that failed rescue attempt, the princes were never reliably seen again. Now, you might be asking, why didn't anyone do something? Why didn't someone demand to see the princes? Why didn't their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, do more? The answer is both simple and heartbreaking. She couldn't. Elizabeth was still in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She had no army, no political power. Richard controlled London, controlled the military, controlled the narrative. Anyone who opposed him too openly risked execution for treason. Several nobles and churchmen may have privately suspected that something terrible had happened, but publicly challenging the new king was suicide, and so, the silence continued. The summer turned to autumn. Autumn turned to winter. And the princes remained invisible. By the end of 1483, most people assumed the worst. Edward and Richard, the princes in the tower, were dead, but how they died, who killed them, and where their bodies were hidden, these questions would haunt England for centuries to come. So what happened to the princes in the tower? Who was responsible for their disappearance? Let's look at the theories. And I'm warning you now, this is where the case gets really dark. Theory 1. Richard III ordered their murder. This is the most famous theory, popularized by Shakespeare and accepted by many historians as the most likely scenario. The logic is straightforward. Richard had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The motive? As long as the princes lived, they were a threat to his rule. Even though Parliament had declared them illegitimate, they were still Edward IV's sons. Many people, perhaps most people, still saw them as the rightful heirs to the throne. Any rebel looking to overthrow Richard could rally around the princes as figureheads. They represented a constant, existential threat to Richard's crown. The means? Richard controlled the Tower. He controlled London. He controlled who had access to the princes and who didn't. If he wanted them dead, no one could stop him. The opportunity? The princes were in his power, isolated, vulnerable. All Richard had to do was give the order. According to this theory, Richard ordered the murders shortly after his coronation, possibly as early as July or August 1483. Various accounts, written years or even decades later, describe different methods: suffocation with pillows, strangulation, poisoning. One particularly detailed account by Thomas More, written in the 1510s, describes two men entering the prince's chamber at night, smothering them with pillows and feather beds, and then burying their bodies at the foot of a staircase in the Tower. But here's the problem: we have no contemporary evidence. No confession. No body, at least, not definitively. The detailed accounts were written years after Richard's death, often by people with a vested interest in making him look guilty. The Tudors, who defeated Richard and took the throne, needed to justify their rule. What better way than to paint Richard as a child-murdering monster? So while Richard is the prime suspect, the case is far from closed. Theory 2. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Here's where it gets interesting. Richard had an ally, a powerful nobleman named Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham had supported Richard's seizure of the throne, had been richly rewarded for his loyalty, and had been given significant power in Wales and Western England. But by October 1483, just months after Richard became king, Buckingham led a rebellion against him. Why? We don't know for certain. But some historians speculate that Buckingham may have been horrified by the murder of the princes. Perhaps Richard ordered Buckingham to carry out the deed, and Buckingham, overcome with guilt or fear, rebelled. Or perhaps Buckingham murdered the princes on his own initiative, thinking he was doing Richard a favor, only to find that Richard was horrified and turned against him. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed in November 1483. Did Buckingham kill the princes? It's possible. He had access. He had opportunity. But without evidence, it remains speculation. Theory 3. They survived. Now, here's a theory that might surprise you. What if the princes didn't die at all? What if they escaped? Or were secretly smuggled out of the Tower? There's actually some historical precedent for this. In the years following Richard's death, several pretenders emerged, claiming to be one of the princes. The most famous was Perkin Warbeck, who appeared in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. He gathered support from foreign powers and even launched an invasion of England. He was eventually captured and executed by Henry VII, but to this day, some people wonder, was he an impostor, or was he really the missing prince? More recently, some researchers have claimed to have found evidence that the princes may have been sent abroad, possibly to Burgundy or Portugal, and lived out their lives in anonymity. One theory suggests that Richard of Shrewsbury lived under the name John of Gloucester and worked as a bricklayer in northern England. These theories are controversial and not widely accepted by mainstream historians. But they persist. The idea that somehow, somewhere, the princes survived is too compelling to completely dismiss. Theory 4. Natural causes. Here's a less sensational but plausible theory. What if the princes simply died of illness? Medieval England was a dangerous place, especially for children. Disease was rampant. Plague, typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, any of these could kill quickly, even in a royal palace. The tower was notoriously damp and cold. If the princes fell ill and died naturally, it would explain their disappearance from public view, but if they died of natural causes, why the secrecy? Why not announce their deaths? Why not give them a proper royal burial? Perhaps Richard feared that announcing their deaths would trigger rebellion. Perhaps he worried people would accuse him of murder regardless of the true cause. Or perhaps, and this is darker, they did die naturally, but Richard saw an opportunity and claimed they were still alive to prevent others from claiming the throne in their name. That we simply don't know. What we do know is this: by the end of 1483, the princes in the tower had vanished. And England had a new king who would rule for just 2 more years before meeting his own violent end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, defeated him and founded the Tudor dynasty. Richard III died in battle, his body thrown into an unmarked grave. His last words, according to legend, were, "Treason, treason, treason." He took his secrets to that grave, but the story doesn't end there. Fast forward almost 200 years. It's 1674. Charles II is king. The Tower of London is being renovated. Workers are demolishing an old staircase near the White Tower, the oldest, most central structure of the fortress. As they dig through the rubble at the base of the stairs, they make a shocking discovery that a wooden box, inside the box, buried beneath centuries of stone and dust, are 2 small skeletons, the bones of 2 children. The workers immediately alert the authorities. The discovery causes a sensation. Could these be the lost princes? After nearly 200 years, had their bodies finally been found? King Charles II believed so. He ordered the remains to be examined by the royal physician, who determined that they belonged to 2 children approximately 12 and 10 years old, roughly the ages of Edward and Richard at the time of their disappearance. Charles ordered the bones to be buried with full royal honors in Westminster Abbey, in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren, the famous architect. An inscription on the urn identifies them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the princes in the tower. Case closed. Right? Not quite, because here's the thing: in 1674, there was no DNA testing. No carbon dating. No modern forensic science. The determination that these were the princes' remains was based largely on where they were found, their approximate age, and the assumption that they must be the missing boys. But what if they weren't? In 1933, the bones were briefly exhumed and examined by anatomists. The examination confirmed that they were the remains of 2 children, but the findings were controversial and inconclusive. Some experts argued that the bones were indeed from the 15th century and belonged to children of roughly the right ages. Others pointed out inconsistencies. One child seemed older than expected, or the bones showed signs of different ages at death. More damningly, the examination was limited. The bones weren't subjected to extensive testing. They were quickly reburied in Westminster Abbey, and there they remain to this day. And here's where it gets really frustrating: modern forensic science could potentially solve this mystery once and for all. DNA testing could determine if the bones are related to known descendants of the royal family. Carbon dating could confirm whether they died in the 1480s or some other period. Isotope analysis could reveal where the children grew up, possibly confirming or ruling out a royal upbringing. But the Church of England and the Dean of Westminster Abbey have consistently refused requests to exonerate and test the remains. They argue that the bones should be left in peace, that disturbing them again would be disrespectful, and that the matter is settled. So the remains in Westminster Abbey sit in their marble urn, tantalizing close to providing answers, but forever out of reach. Are they really the princes in the tower? We may never know for certain. Over 500 years have passed since Edward and Richard disappeared. 500 years of speculation, investigation, accusation, and debate. 500 years of unanswered questions. Why does this case still fascinate us? Why do we still care about two boys who died, or vanished, over half a millennium ago? I think it's because this case represents something fundamental about power and innocence. About the darkness that lurks at the heart of political ambition. These weren't adults embroiled in the Wars of the Roses. These weren't warriors or nobles who knew the risks of the game they were playing. These were children. 12 and 9 years old. Boys who should have been learning, playing, growing up. Boys who had done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of being born into royalty at a time when the crown was worth killing for. Edward and Richard were pawns in a game they didn't choose to play. They were born to privilege, yes, but that privilege became their death sentence. Because in the brutal calculus of medieval politics, their very existence was intolerable. As long as they lived, they threatened someone else's power. And so, most likely, they were murdered. Murdered by whom? We think Richard III, but we can't be certain. Murdered how? Suffocation, probably, but we don't know. Buried where? Under a staircase, perhaps, or somewhere else in the tower, or somewhere no one has ever looked. The uncertainty is maddening. And maybe that's part of what keeps this case alive. Unlike so many historical events that have been documented, analyzed, and settled, the fate of the princes in the tower remains genuinely mysterious. It's a cold case that has never been solved, and it matters because it reminds us of the cost of power. The human cost. The children who disappear into dungeons and towers, who vanish from history, who become ghost stories and cautionary tales. Throughout history, how many other children have disappeared like this? How many have been erased by those who saw them as obstacles? In medieval Europe, in ancient Rome, in dynasties across Asia and Africa, royal children who simply vanished when they became inconvenient. That we remember Edward and Richard because they were princes of England, because their story was recorded, because they left traces in history. But behind every throne, there are probably stories we'll never know. Children who disappeared without names, without records, without marble urns in Westminster Abbey. The princes in the tower became symbols, symbols of innocence destroyed by ambition, symbols of the darkness of the medieval world, symbols of mysteries that resist resolution, and their story isn't quite over yet. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to solve the mystery of the princes in the tower. Historians have combed through documents in archives across Europe, looking for any contemporary account, any letter, any scrap of evidence that might confirm what happened. Some have claimed new discoveries, mentions of the princes in foreign correspondence, references to their deaths in obscure manuscripts, theories about how they might have escaped. The most intriguing recent development comes from the Langley investigation, named after historian Filippo Langley, who was instrumental in the discovery and identification of Richard III's remains in 2012. Yes, that's right, Richard III's body was found under a parking lot in Leicester, and DNA testing confirmed his identity. If we could find and identify Richard, why not the princes? Langley and other researchers have proposed new searches of the Tower of London using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies to look for additional burial sites. They've argued for testing the bones in Westminster Abbey. They've examined architectural plans of the tower from the 15th century, trying to identify locations where bodies might have been hidden. Some researchers have even claimed to have found documents suggesting that Richard of Shrewsbury survived and lived quietly in England under an assumed identity, working as a master builder. These claims are highly controversial and haven't been accepted by mainstream historians, but they show that the case is far from closed in some people's minds. There have also been literary and dramatic investigations. Novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers continue to reimagine the story. Some portray Richard as a villain. Others try to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he was framed by Tudor propaganda. The Richard III Society, a group dedicated to defending the king's legacy, argues vigorously that he was innocent of the prince's murder and that the real killer was likely someone else, Henry VII, or Buckingham, or some other shadowy figure. The debate rages on. Books are published every year arguing one theory or another. Academic conferences dissect every piece of evidence. Online forums are filled with amateur sleuths presenting their solutions, and yet, despite all this attention, despite all this investigation, we are no closer to knowing the truth than we were in 1483. The bones in Westminster Abbey remain untested. The Tower has revealed no new secrets. The archives have yielded no smoking gun. The princes in the Tower remain missing, lost somewhere between history and legend, between fact and myth. So where does that leave us? Two boys entered the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. By autumn, they had vanished. Most historians believe they were murdered, probably on Richard III's orders, probably by suffocation. Their bodies were likely buried somewhere in or near the tower, possibly under a staircase where bones were found in 1674. But we don't know for certain. We may never know for certain, and maybe that's the most haunting part of this story. Not just that two children died, though that's tragic enough, but that they died in obscurity, their fate hidden, their truth lost. They were erased from history, as completely as if they had never existed, except they weren't quite erased. Because we're still talking about them. Still investigating. Still trying to understand what happened in that tower over 500 years ago. Edward and Richard have become eternal mysteries, frozen in time. Forever 12 and 9 years old. Forever the princes in the tower. Their story reminds us that history isn't always neat. It doesn't always provide answers. Sometimes, the most important questions remain unanswered. Sometimes, the truth stays buried, literally and figuratively, but it also reminds us of the importance of asking those questions. Of not forgetting. Of keeping the memory of the disappeared alive, even when centuries have passed, because somewhere, whether in Westminster Abbey or still hidden in the tower or scattered to dust long ago, the remains of two young boys rest. They were princes once. They should have been kings. Instead, they became victims of a world that valued power over innocence, ambition over justice. We can't bring them back. We can't undo what was done to them. But we can remember. We can tell their story. We can keep asking, what happened to the princes in the tower? What do you think happened to Edward and Richard? Do you believe Richard III ordered their murder? Do you think they might have escaped? Do you believe the bones in Westminster Abbey are really theirs? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I love hearing your theories on these cases. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep making these videos for you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new case. We cover missing persons from throughout history, some recent, some ancient, but all unsolved, all haunting, all deserving to be remembered. Coming up next week, we're investigating another medieval disappearance that will blow your mind, the strange case of the vanishing village of Anjikuni Lake, where an entire Inuit community supposedly disappeared without a trace. You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and never forget the missing.